Corey Rubadue from Chaos Group, AEC and Design VP, based in Baltimore. Trained as an architect, practiced for years. Started working with V-Ray in 2004, customizing some CAD programs that we had that we're using in architectural practice back then, and subsequently was acquired by, made a startup in 2005, which basically we started selling V-Ray for Rhino and later V-Ray for SketchUp. In 2011, we merged with the Chaos Group and brought those two products into our overall portfolio. And as it goes nowadays, really solidly focused on architecture, engineering, construction, and design space. In this case, for the most part of this presentation, I'll cover AEC with a few spots talking about just design work. The first thing I want to just kind of mention in our AEC and design space, there's a pretty large differentiation between folks who visualize on a general term, in general terms, just day in, day out, iterating through design work, thinking about the space they're designing, the forms, and structural elements versus non-structural elements, so on and so forth, versus folks who are doing super high-end images, photorealism, for later stages in a project. And the complexities associated with that are something that is of pretty strong interest to me in how we develop and push the boundaries of our technology in the AEC and design spaces. Just a rough overview of what an architectural practice or a project manager might look like. In this case, have a main architect on the far left, and then on the right we have the visualization specialist, who could be in-house or out-of-house or something like that. But at the end of the day, the boundary, the purple dotted line, is essentially the boundary of, let's say visualization and a practice of architecture, where not all the key stakeholders that are involved in a particular design process or project are involved with the visualization efforts with the project, but rather they are part of a process. And in architecture, they have several phases of building design, and I'll just show a few examples of this. But the idea is that in each phase, there's an enormous amount of data that is displayed visually, whether it's from 2D CAD drawings printed out to high-end images, or nowadays VR and experiences, for instance. But all in all, the green line is essentially the top of the food chain in the project life cycle. These guys are more focused and most focused on the solid presentation at the end of a phase, for instance. And in this case, I'm looking at a schematic design phase, which could look as wild and chaotic and crazy as something like this, where you have anywhere between just sketches, post-it notes, and so on and so forth to help portray a design concept or partie in architecture. And then the next phase might be considered design development, which is where plans and sections and elevations all get evolved into a bit more refinement level of detail, so on and so forth. And maybe you start building some more character around the visuals, bringing context in, and elevating the actual renderings and so on and so forth that you're producing to portray the level of design that you're at that particular phase. And then you get into the later phases of a project, where you might have a BIM model working in Revit or something like that, and you're doing again another round of graphics, and the graphics that come out of the project get infinitely more complicated. You have to now start describing what the building is going to not just look like, but how it's going to be built and constructed. So all the way through this, you get to the point where you're in construction phase and you still have to iterate through different on-site conditions, and people have to look at photographs of construction site or be on the construction site and then evaluate visually with your Revit data, for instance, in this case, what design decision either went wrong or is exactly right. But all this, reason why I'm showing this is because the complexities in this process all, at the end of the day, are why we ended up building V-Ray for Rhino back in the day, and it's why we're building V-Ray for Revit and SketchUp. And we have these layers of visualization, and these are, let's just say, small icebergs, if you will, inside of the architectural design process, where at the front end of a project you can have a ton of software packages involved at the beginning, and you're expected to visualize among this whole landscape of programs, right? And in some cases, data sets are similar, they overlap, they're not talking to each other, and you end up in a situation where you have to use a program like 3 Studio Max, for instance, or another visualization DCC package where you can aggregate all the data in that one package and then visualize, let's say. And the lines that you see there, essentially, the client isn't necessarily one that's going to be doing the visualization work, right? And the architect kind of is involved in the process up until the point where the building gets turned over to the owner. Engineers are involved at a certain point in the process, contractors get involved, building managers get involved. And each one of these parties and stakeholders has to have a visual reference and understanding of the project. So in the grand scheme of things visually, kind of based on our experience and analysis, the purple line is, as I showed earlier, essentially the visualization expert or specialist. He or she, in this case, embarks on different visualization projects during the life cycle of the project, but you can see some of the other green lines which are going up and down and crossing different platforms and going between SketchUp and Rhino and back to Revit and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, they're all still trying to make sure that they have visual consistency in their pipelines. So kind of one way of looking at things nowadays is if we have V-Ray for Revit, Max, SketchUp, and a handful of other applications there. What we end up kind of looking at is this situation where we have V-Ray plugged into some of these visualization lines, if you will, that in some cases is redundant. We might have V-Ray data and Rhino and SketchUp on the same project, or Revit, Rhino, SketchUp in some cases. So I just want to before we transition to the next stuff, I just want to say a little bit about the Chaos Group in general. Our DNA is essentially, we're artists, we're designers, a lot of us. In many cases, we are our own customer in many regards. And we personally and professionally are invested in just about every pixel that gets rendered with V-Ray, from feature films to the smallest piece of jewelry you can imagine. And so over the years, we've generated a huge portfolio of products and technologies. V-Ray, of course, spanning from 3 Studio Max to Blender, and then Fluid Sim, Phoenix, or VR Scans technology, all the way down to supporting our render farms, which actually support our community in a large way as well. So that's now, and what we're working on now in some of our recent products and where we're going is essentially the whole point is ease of use, easy, make things accessible and understandable and digestible. I can quote several of our architectural customers as saying, I just need one button to render. I don't want all this other stuff. Trouble is that V-Ray as an engine itself has many parameters to control it. It's getting to a point where some people would say that they don't want to use V-Ray because of its complexity. And so with our latest products in Rhino and SketchUp, we're really pushing this ease of use, and we've developed a cross-platform, cross-product user interface. And it's as easy as it can be at the moment. We have some legacy products that we have to support. So we do have not just simple controls, but we do have some advanced controls that fly out on the right side of this dashboard, if you will. And then at the top is essentially your dashboard, materials, lights, geometry, basic render settings, render button, and frame buffer. All this collapses up into just that one toolbar, for instance. And then on the left side here, we have our the beginning of what we're calling our asset editor. And of course, if you still need to get under the hood and get some more detail into your settings, we still have the legacy settings for all our V-Ray materials. So user experience on the level of inside the application has been completely redesigned from the ground up. And our next focus really is making sure V-Ray is very fast and efficient, and this happens on many levels. But you know, one of the biggest things that makes V-Ray so powerful is its twin rendering engine capability, being able to render GPU and CPU and have fairly seamless and consistent results between both processing methods. And so bringing this CPU and GPU into V-Ray RT or production rendering inside of SketchUp and Rhino has been something that's super optimized, super clean, super fast. Literally, it's a couple toggle switches to flip back and forth between the two. And then the larger component that we brought into those two products and V-Ray for Revit as well is our new distributed rendering. Let's say adaptation or innovation is V-Ray Swarm, which if any of you have rendered with V-Ray before know about distributed rendering, essentially under the hood there's we're using distributed rendering, but we have kind of somehow, let's say, democratized, if you will, the rendering process, made it a lot easier to manage and to pool up even smaller scale resources in your studio environments so that you can put more CPU and GPU power clustered together to create, to render your imagery. And just a simple video, if it plays. So decent sized resolution, you see the progress bar here, and enabling distributed rendering, and the slider bar is actually, it's pretty cool. So I'm just basically taking and ramping up to 100% all available resources that I have in my network, and in this case, I can actually dial it back down, and if I'm not in a hurry and if I want to give some resources up to other folks, I can actually put it back down to a lower percentage. But obviously people are interested in the speed of getting things done, and they're pretty much always at 100%. But in any case, if you have friends in your studio, you can share the resources dynamically, that is. So ease of use, fast, and then powerful. With V-Ray for Revit, Rhino, SketchUp, we're based on the 3.x core or V-Ray itself, the engine. This is pretty much the first time in our history that we're pretty close to parity with V-Ray for Max and our V-Ray for Maya products. I'm hoping that by the end of this year and when we start getting into the 4.0 products, we'll be completely in sync with our versions and the core and so on and so forth. So hopefully gone are the days that people are saying, well, I have adaptive lights in V-Ray for Max 3.5, where are they in Rhino or Revit or SketchUp? And they'll be there as quickly as they are in the other applications. The other thing that makes these three products so powerful is they're built on what's called our application SDK. And the application SDK itself is essentially a abstraction of the V-Ray core SDK that allows us to talk to the core in different languages. So in SketchUp, we might use Ruby and C++, and Revit, it's .NET, for instance, and there's no way we can afford to as we have in the past tried to do, which is to completely write each plugin from scratch with the core API SDK, and it just takes a long time to engineer every single product from scratch. So this abstraction it's critical towards this idea of going towards full parity, right? So the cool part about the app SDK is it's available to anyone really to license and build their own applications. So we just happen to be our own guinea pigs in this situation. Another powerful step forward in our portfolio is how we're approaching materials. With the new products, probably long overdue, but we are shipping a library of pre-made V-Ray materials, about 550 at the moment, and it's growing. So develop specific libraries of standard V-Ray materials that are supporting the industrial design, architecture, engineering, construction spaces. And these materials are cross-product in our own portfolio, so we can share these materials in between Rhino, SketchUp, Revit, Max, and whatnot. So the idea of now having a common material format for V-Ray is we're one step closer to that. VR scans is also, our scan material is something that you may or may not have heard about, but we are looking at ways to bring VR scans into our AEC portfolio. Right now, there's certain complexities and challenges that we have with this, but at the end of the day, we have folks that are using it, and we'll work to streamline this process. It's incredibly effective in the product design space. Architecture and engineering have their own challenges to implement the scan materials, but they're there and supported in our AEC applications. The other big component that we're pushing on right now really hard, at least in between Rhino and SketchUp and Revit, and thankfully because of the application SDK, is to push the idea of a V-Ray ecosystem, for instance, so firms can actually, again, share materials, share different assets that are made in V-Ray using V-Ray proxy technology, for instance, or V-Ray scene information to transport back and forth between teammates. This is Revit file, and in the interface here, there's a export VR scene button up here, and we can export this VR scene file format, and nowadays link that VR scene format directly in 3 Studio Max and hit render and get pretty much the same results the same rendering results that you received inside of Revit, with a few exceptions. But this is stuff that we're fine tuning right now. But the idea of having this Revit file, let's say linked as a VR scene, being able to go back to Revit, make some tweaks, and update this VR scene file inside of Max, takes a lot of let's say headache away from the visualization specialist who just wants to build the camera setups and produce the animation and maybe fine tune some lighting, but not necessarily worry about the geometry of the building, for instance. So coming soon, next week we will be shipping V-Ray for Rhino 3.0, and it's the most important update to the product that we've had since its original release, to be honest. Again, with the application SDK underneath it, with our new user interface on top of it, material library, all these things that I mentioned, all layered on top of V-Ray for Rhino. Incredibly powerful. The user interface as a language, if you will, between V-Ray applications. This is just an example of, in this case, V-Ray rectilinear light and how the UI looks here. If you open this same dialog box or light up inside of Rhino, inside of SketchUp, you'll see the same exact parameters. So there's really essentially not much learning curve involved with actually going cross-product, right? And getting some images like this. Another cool feature in V-Ray 3 for Rhino, the V-Ray Clipper, supports just one clipping plane, 2, 3, 4, doesn't matter, but also supports using a mesh as a clipper object. But again, if you're talking to your colleagues in your office, and one's in Revit and one's in SketchUp, you can talk about V-Ray Clipper, and you can talk about the same options and the same parameters in between both applications. Again, learning curve is completely reduced. You don't have to learn how to use the V-Ray Clipper in a different way inside of Rhino versus SketchUp, let's say. And then let's say camera controls, again, just being consistent, showing some of the user interface. And the controls there, the simplicity involved, and again, reiterating that these controls are the same ones that you would find inside of SketchUp. Another cool part about V-Ray 3 for Rhino is we're pushing the whole Grasshopper connectivity between V-Ray, Grasshopper, and Rhino. In fact, I just got a new set of scripts last night that were connecting up the VR scans material and OSL shader language shader support inside of Grasshopper. So being able to make changes in Grasshopper on the fly and render with V-Ray RT, interactively rendering and making these changes in Grasshopper and seeing this stuff, being able to visualize and understand what these parameters are doing and how how your designs are being affected is actually, this is pretty cool, because this is also the V-Ray clippers invoked here. So in real time, again, moving the clipper plane in the Rhino viewport, you're actually clipping. Wrap your head around this. You're doing parametric changes in Grasshopper, and you're manipulating a V-Ray clipper plane, and all while rendering in interactive mode. And then you might end up with a design and a facade that looks something like that. And then just briefly, not to totally brush off the design space, but I think most folks can probably wrap their heads around the consistencies between AEC feature sets and all the stuff that I've been talking about with the ease, power, and speed and fast. V-Ray for Rhino 3.0 in viewport rendering mode, so V-Ray RT is rendering directly in the Rhino viewport. That's not the most important part. But I, again, can go to the V-Ray menu file, export VR scene file, and then I can run over to Maya and quite literally link this VR scene file that I just exported and hit render, and I get pretty much the identical result here inside of Maya without lifting a finger on the geometry, materials, or lighting setup. So again, cool part here is at the tail end of your pipeline, the visualization specialists who want to focus on setting up the camera rigs, doing the animation work for advertising or print collateral pieces, for instance. They can come in here and not have to worry about getting the materials right, not necessarily worry about starting from scratch on the lighting, so on and so forth, but they actually have a really good foundation to work from. So this is something that we're working towards. And then I say, what if? If you remember the diagram I had with the icebergs and V-Ray being dotted across each vertical, what if we had something that looked something like this, where all applications could be aware of V-Ray, and V-Ray could be aware of all those applications? So sharing materials, lights, rendering settings, even interface becomes just a seamless and fluid process, if you will. Visualization just becomes a part of your everyday workflow. It doesn't become a barrier to your design work. It doesn't become a barrier to meeting deadlines. It doesn't hold you back in any way, but it just becomes part of every aspect of what you're doing. So that's all I have. Thank you.